Hello again, my brilliant, talented, role-filling recruiting pals. I'm thrilled you took a break from sourcing and listing and recruiting your little hearts out to tune into my humble podcast. I have a wonderful guest joining me today. Lead talent strategist at GitHub, Tessa Wilder, has agreed to do a webinar with us about sourcing on GitHub and Stack Overflow, HackerNews, a few other places. So we thought we'd do a little teaser trailer for that webinar by having her on the podcast. We ended up having a great conversation about how to stand out on Hacker News and sort of ingratiate yourself with the, at times, intimidating user base there. We cover how to properly assess GitHub profiles. She would know. She works at GitHub after all. And I can't wait for you to hear this one. If you enjoy it, the webinar is on May 16th at 10 a.m. Pacific. There's a link to it in the episode description. There's a link on hiringonallcylinders.com, so go over and register for it. Won't you? Okay. Enough intro, let's do it. Please give a warm HOAC welcome to the wonderful Tessa Wilder.
Do you want to add value to your business, or do you want to just be this administrative person?
And often if you look at your talent team and the caliber of talent in your company, they correlate.
You could hire the best person for the job if they were in your candidate pool.
All these individual employees, one by one, together, their voices all come together to articulate the culture of the company.
This is
Hiring on all
cylinders.
Tessa Wilder, remote podcasting in from the Pacific Northwest. So glad you're here. How are we today?
Hey, yeah, it's sunny out in Seattle, so everything is going well.
Bit of rare sunshine in Seattle, so it's got to have you in a good mood, I'm sure.
Oh, yeah. I mean, I looked outside and saw that it was sunny, and I already got sunburnt, so it's a good problem to have.
Right off the bat. I love it. So you have such a tremendous amount of experience. You're helping us out by doing this webinar about recruiting engineering talent via GitHub, Stack Overflow, Hacker News, a few other places. And I kind of want to work through all those without cannibalizing the upcoming webinar. I guess in the interest of not doing that, can you kind of give us a high-level overview of what you're going to be talking about?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, coming from GitHub, one of the things I really want to focus on is how you approach GitHub as a platform for sourcing. I think there are appropriate ways to approach it. And then, as I'm sure you're aware, and certainly myself from going through it, there are also not appropriate ways to approach the platform when reaching out to engineers. So definitely want to spend some time there. I want to cover GitHub Explore, which I think is something that is overlooked and underutilized by individuals in our profession. So something I'm really excited to dig into. And then also just kind of high level, like covering, how do you reach out to individuals on Hacker News? What is the best approach for that? How do you own maybe messing up when you reach out to someone and the reaction that you might get back to that as well? And just kind of high level, kind of going through all of those different platforms with, that right or wrong approach, that lens.
Yeah, definitely. Okay, I have a million questions. First of all, what's GitHub Explore?
Yeah, well, I mean, I said you didn't want to ruin it for the webinar, so I hate to give away too much here. What are you doing? No, GitHub Explore is actually, it's a site that you can go to, /explore on GitHub. And it's an area where we break down a lot of the different work that people are doing in the open source community into what I kind of interpret as more easily approachable topics. So you might see things like social impact projects. You might see things like software-defined radio projects, writing projects, projects around open source integrations or text editors, right? So from a recruiting and sourcing perspective, it's a great way for us to get in and already start to understand different buckets that these open source projects fall into and different things that people are working on for us to then go in and source those individuals out of, right?
Whoa, yeah. So I'm looking at it right now, and so there's the showcases feature, and then it's broken down into clean code linters, DevOps tools, virtual reality. So serverless architecture. So if you're a recruiter, go to sections that are repositories that are already about the kind of thing you need.
Yep, exactly. So you can find that there's .NET community projects in there, which is already helping you from a sourcing perspective understand that's probably where I need to invest my time if I'm looking for people who work in .NET, C#, right? And then, of course, there's JavaScript projects. So if I'm looking for someone who's working in JavaScript, that's a great place for me to start as well. And then you can kind of start to dig in for the contributors there. And again, just an easier place for us to start because a lot of us don't have those technical backgrounds, right? So we struggle understanding how do we find these people? how do we know if they're really front end or back end? And this is just an easier approach to that.
Gotcha. So yeah, that sort of is an example of what I wanted to ask you, which is that, most recruiters know what a repository, know what a fork is on GitHub. They have some kind of working familiarity with it. I'm curious how you, like, coming from GitHub, use profiles to assess if someone's legit or not. Is it necessary to actually read through their code? How can you tell if someone really stands out?
Yeah, I mean, I don't know about you or a lot of other recruiters that you might know, but most of the recruiters I know, and this good recruiters and good sourcers, wouldn't necessarily be able to tell you if someone was good if they read through the code anyways, right?
Yeah.
So if I look at it that way, it's kind of an easy way to get in trouble. I don't want to start speaking about, oh, I see you're doing JavaScript code. It looks like you might be good for this front end role, and then have that engineer reach back out and say, you're crazy. I actually have never worked on JavaScript code. You have no idea what you're talking about. So again, I think it's important to look at a GitHub profile, HackerNews, really any social media profile, and try to understand where your strengths come into that. And for a lot of us, it's the research portion, right? So whether that's cross-referencing a GitHub profile with maybe a LinkedIn profile to kind of break down what they're working on, or for me personally, I actually like to go in and see the different comments that they have on the code. So typically engineers on the profile or on the platform are doing things like code reviews, right? So you can go in there and actually see their documentation around the commits that they're doing or around their README profiles for the projects they're working on. And I'm personally more interested in the ability to communicate through that README profile, which tends to be the landing page for most projects because it sets up what the project is about. I'm more interested in that because written communication is so critical in any job, right? And it's something that I can evaluate. Working at a company myself where we're remote, written communication every day, right? And then of course my job really is dependent in terms of outbound sourcing and outbound recruiting on the written communication component. So going in and reading those READMEs, do they make sense, right? Are there a ton of grammatical errors? Like, these are things that I consider myself to be somewhat more proficient in than code,
right?
But as equally telling if someone is going to be qualified to work here based on how they're able to document their thought process, right? And the technical components and kind of break them down into layman terms. So that's something I think a lot of us don't pay attention to that we should definitely be focusing more on.
Yeah, that's interesting. It sort of speaks to their ability to collaborate more than their ability to just write code.
Yeah, it's, I think, one of those things where it's not the tangible piece sometimes, right? And we focus a lot on hiring for the culture and hiring the right fit. And I'm using air quotes. I know no one can see me right now. But they say that that's a slippery slope and it's a little dangerous, right? When you're looking for those types of things. And so being able to point it back to something that is tangible, like this is how this person documents their information, that's relevant and important in any company that's trying to hire good talent, right? And oftentimes something that also isn't tested as well during the interview process. And so coming to your hiring managers with those details and that information can definitely set you apart from a lot of other recruiters and sourcers out there.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. So in the, I guess on the flip side of that coin, in terms of things you look for that are positive indicators, what are there any things that are sort of red flags on a GitHub profile? I'm thinking of, for example, if you see someone has 220,000 Twitter followers, but they're following themselves 214,000 people, you know that, like, that's not an organic following and that they've just sort of gamed the system. Is there anything that's like kind of like that for GitHub where you're like, okay, it looks like they have a built out, active, engaged profile, but there's something about it's not quite right?
Yeah. I don't necessarily look at profiles in that light, right? And I think it's something that we touched on a little bit earlier as well. Sure, I guess you could see the growth is not organic, or say that, okay, there's something off about this profile where this person isn't maybe legit, as you pointed out. But I think I always use my own profile as an example of that on Twitter. I'm a legit, again, air quotes, person, or I like to think I'm pretty legit, with a legit career and
of course you are.
an actual human being. But I think I have 200 followers. And, I think that doesn't necessarily telling of my ability to do my job. And I think the same goes for GitHub. You'll go in and you'll see that some people have a few thousand followers, but a lot of that is just because they're working on open source projects that tend to have a lot of followers, the projects themselves, right? Okay. And people start to follow the people that are working on those projects. So don't necessarily see it as a red flag. But I think in our industry, too often people look at the lack of followers, right? Or the lack of commits as a red flag. And I think that's actually more dangerous, because you have to understand that not everyone's using these profiles as a way to connect and communicate or a social platform with one another, right? Some people are just using GitHub because their boss made them sign up for GitHub, and they use like their personal account for their day-to-day work at their job. They're not trying to get 500 followers, right? Or they don't have time to contribute to the open source community. And I think, right now where sourcing and recruiting is we continue to think about diversity and inclusion in the work that we're doing. You have to understand that you're already creating this barrier to entry based on your interpretation of followers or not enough followers, right? You're already setting this kind of imaginary bar, which is really, really dangerous. And so I try to look at that as a positive thing. Like if they are doing really meaningful work, or if their Twitter looks really interesting to me, even if they only have 10 followers, I want to reach out. And those are usually the profiles that end up getting back to you saying, wow, I don't really get a lot of people reaching out to me on here, so this is pretty cool, versus the Twitter profile that might have 20,000 where you get lost in the noise. But I think it's important to look at either amount of those followers or contributors or commits as being legit, because you just don't know what people have time or don't have time for.
Yeah, absolutely. That's a great point. So your advice would just be to not get caught up in the kind of bells and whistles of like social engagement, and instead focus on the content.
Absolutely.
Yeah,
absolutely. I think that's what really great recruiters and sourcers tend to do, right? Is you put some of those other maybe indicators aside and you really look and focus on the content and the work that person's doing. And you don't hesitate to cross-reference other platforms, right?
Of course.
So maybe they've got a bunch of people on Twitter, but okay, I go on LinkedIn and it seems pretty normal. Or I go to GitHub and it seems like a fairly normal profile. Everything lines up. Make sure you're doing your due diligence, right?
Yeah, of course. It's also sort of a cop-out in that it doesn't put faith in your own evaluative process, right? If you're like, oh, they have this many followers, social proof, they must be good, right? That's sort of a lazy way to assess someone. So like I said, this just makes sense to ignore that kind of thing. And as you point out, not everyone is using it for that. So it's silly to use that as a barometer for ability.
Yeah, no, I certainly don't use it as one of the parameters that I typically look at, but I certainly think it's something to be aware of, right?
Yeah, absolutely. So I guess kind of on that note of like engineering in a social capacity, HackerNews, I guess we're going to cover briefly in the webinar too. And HackerNews is an awesome place to find people, and Intello has made a bunch of hires off of HackerNews, but it's intimidating, right? Like the bar for content is really, really high, and like both material-wise that you would submit and both comments. So I guess my question is like, how can recruiters get in there and start meeting and engaging people without getting stomped on?
Yeah, I think HackerNews is in a lot of ways similar to GitHub, right? I think the open source community in general is a very unforgiving community, or historically has been an unforgiving community. Totally. I think that's my favorite way of like really putting it, is this unforgiving community. And I think both platforms are trying to do a better job, right? So things aren't getting out of control or as escalated as they used to. So it's becoming a safer community to be a part of. But I still think, to your point, there are some unforgiving components. And I think especially being a recruiter or sourcer, we already start with the odds against us in a lot of ways, right? People look at your profile and they're like, oh gosh, like a recruiter's reaching out to me, gross.
Yeah.
Or, oh gosh, it's going to be the sales pitch. Or let's be honest, like I get emails from recruiters all the time that say I'd be a great Drupal developer. And I'm not a Drupal developer, right? And this is my own profession, and I'm getting these emails, and it's very like, there are a lot of people out there that maybe don't take the job as seriously or don't do this amount of research or due diligence. And it's unfortunate, but that's the world we live in. And so I think every time we approach something in the open source community like HackerNews or various other platforms, we kind of have to keep that in mind, right? The approach needs to be thoughtful, and that already sets us apart from other individuals that are maybe also reaching out on that platform. And I think you have to do your research. And it's funny, I'll probably say the word research 500 times. I've never actually been in a peer research role, but it's such an important piece of our day-to-day work that we do in sourcing and recruiting, right? You have to be knowledgeable about the subject you're selling, because at the end of the day, it's harder than a sales role. We're not selling anything tangible. We're not selling you a pen, right? We're not selling you a pad of paper. We're selling you this idea or this concept of a culture, of a job, something bigger that you want to be part of. And it's hard. It's really, really hard to do. And you want to do it really, really well. And so I think, when reaching out on those platforms, the most important thing to remember is just be yourself. Don't be afraid to do it, because that's already like setting the odds against yourself, right? Like, I'm scared to do it. I'm going to say something that's silly. They're going to react really negatively towards it. Well, guess what? 80% of the time that I say something silly that I think people are going to attack me for, they don't. Like,
Right.
people in the community are actually like, oh, no, you want to learn more about that? Let me teach you. Oh, you actually said that you're hiring for a platform engineer, but that sounds more of like an infrastructure role. Let me tell you about how it's a little bit different, or where my skills might fit into that, right? It's actually a community full of people that want to educate you to be better at your job and to do better, right? But we approach it so often with this like level of hesitation. I think you yourself said it was kind of scary on Hacker News, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. And so I think, the way we approach it is already part of the problem. I think we need to have more confidence when we approach those platforms. Obviously, one of the things I really like to do, and one of the things that I think a lot of people have the ability to do, is run the content by engineers on your team, right? Build a really strong relationship with one of your hiring managers. Let them know that you want to participate in Hacker News more. Ask them how they feel it might be appropriate that you do that, right? How should I approach it? If I say something like this, does it come off as maybe uneducated about the subject? If I say this, does it sound spammy or salesy? Engineers are our best resources in that way. And the hiring managers that we build those relationships with genuinely usually want to help us, right? So let's utilize our resources there. But I think the other part is going in wanting to learn, because most people do want to teach you more about the work they're doing, and especially Hacker News. People are really excited about the stuff on there. I'm really excited when it's about their company. I get excited about everything that's posted about GitHub, even if it's some of the stuff where we have trolls that are talking about how our data centers go down, whatever the problem is. I still see it as an opportunity to go in there and say, well, why do you feel this way, right? Or, oh, how could the product be better? Because this is all information that you can take with you when it comes to recruiting talent into your company. Or even just learning about the company landscape. So again, approaching it with more confidence, I think, is step number one, but then utilizing your resources when approaching it is equally important.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm glad you said that, because in that context, your success is ultimately your hiring manager's success, or your individual contributing engineer's success, right? Like, the better you do, the more likely that you are to be able to deliver them their teammate who's going to make their life easier.
Yep, absolutely.
I guess, like, on a specific level, though, there's those monthly threads that are who's hiring on Hacker News. Do you wait for one of those? Do you just like jump into the conversation and start asking questions? Like, specifically, if I was going to get into Hacker News right now in the interest of finding someone to begin recruiting, what should I do?
Yeah, well, you mentioned monthly. I mean, I make it part of my daily work. It's kind of one of the first things I do, right? I wake up in the morning and I time block all my calendar off for this specifically, but I like to go see what's going on in TechCrunch, because I think that's a good start of like, what am I expecting to see on Hacker News as a result of what I see on TechCrunch usually? And then I see like, okay, what's going on in the startup world? Okay, this is happening, this is happening. So I have a little bit more information off of the TechCrunch platform before I jump right into Hacker News. But the second place I go every morning is Hacker News. I don't wait necessarily like once a month to check in, or the who's hiring board, but do like to make it part of my daily routine. And I think that helps me in a few ways, right? You never know when you're going to see information that you feel confident that you can jump in on. And that's why I like to check it daily. There might be some things that interest me more than others, maybe based on some companies I've worked at in the past, right? Some cultural questions that come up, something around hiring that I might feel like I actually do know enough about to participate in, but also because I want to learn what's going on in these companies, and I want to use that information for my reach outs, whether that's on Twitter or LinkedIn, or for the conversations I have, getting someone on the phone and they're like, oh yeah, did you hear about this that happened yesterday? I'm like, well, I did, because I was on Hacker News and I saw it.
Right.
And,
yeah.
Again, like, always look for ways that can set you apart from your competitors or your competition. And in this situation, it's, other recruiters, other sourcers, other companies. But not everyone does check it. And so if you know that information and you can have a real conversation around, I don't know, the Gmail phishing issue, right, that happened.
Oh, yeah.
Like, using that as a concrete example, people then feel like, oh, wow, you're not just a recruiter. You're not just reaching out to me. Like, you actually are invested in what's going on in my world, in my industry, in the community. And you want to have real conversations about that. And it doesn't always necessarily need to be conversations around me saying like, yeah, let me tell you how that phishing scheme worked, because I might not know, but they might, and they want to talk about it and tell me about it. And that learning opportunity for me is a great way to build that rapport, a great way to kind of be memorable with that person, right? And then a great way to just kind of continue that relationship afterwards of maybe sending them more Hacker News articles that come up that I think that we could have a mutual interest or talk about. And so again, I tend to make it part of my daily routine, and I just jump right in. I know for some friends of mine, they like to create maybe a different persona. And that's on Twitter as well, but not necessarily affiliating themselves with a company or as a recruiter, but just be a person, a human on the platform first, and start to kind of figure out what works for you and what doesn't work for you, and if it's something you genuinely enjoy doing. Because I think at the end of the day, the most important thing to note about it is not every recruiter or sourcer needs to be on Hacker News to make their hires, right? I think creative approaches are so important. And yes, it's part of my wheelhouse and I get excited about it, but I've met equally great recruiters and sourcers that have never even heard of Hacker News. And that's okay, because they invest their time and resources in the things that yield results for them, right? And the things that they're comfortable in. And I think at the end of the day, like, if you're trying to use a platform that you're not comfortable with, it shows to your audience, right? And it shows to your bottom line and your results. So you need to be comfortable with it. You need to be confident in your approach. You need to feel good about how you're using it, and you need to thoroughly enjoy it. It goes back to the work we do every day. Like, our job is to sell. And as soon as we don't feel like we can sell the company or the culture or that concept that we're selling, we usually move on to a different job, right? And so think of the same way, use that kind of to inform yourself when it comes to using different platforms and investing your time into these different areas where you can find candidates.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I guess at the very least, you should use it to educate yourself about the industry, just so you can speak intelligently when it comes time to talking to engineers about your space and about like the specific languages you're working on.
Yeah, absolutely. And to see who is hiring, right? We all want to know. We all want to know what the companies are doing and who's going IPO, right?
Right.
So it's a good way to keep a pulse, I think, of the industry.
Yeah, absolutely. So Tessa, we kind of just jumped right into it because I was excited and I had a million questions to ask you, but I feel like I don't even know you. What are you? Well, I mean, I know your background, I know where you worked and everything, and we've had tons of fun chatting offline or off microphone. But what roles are you working on right now?
Yeah, my name was Tessa. I was born in Idaho in 19. No, I'm just kidding.
At a young age.
Yeah, started when I was a wee lad. So yeah, I've done a little bit of everything at GitHub. I started primarily as their diversity sourcer. I've done full lifecycle recruiting here, typically with an emphasis in technology. That's kind of been my sweet spot. But as of recently, I'm working on a lot of VP level roles, which has been pretty fun. And that kind of spans all over the place. I'm still in tech, but also doing a little bit of sales engineering, a little bit of marketing, jack of all trades, if you will. But my emphasis right now tends to be more on the sourcing side of the house. And so we call our team the Talent Strategist team here at GitHub. I will say I pushed pretty heavily for that. I really believe that sourcing is so much more than name generation, right? I think we have the ability to really build this strategy from start to finish of how we approach outbound recruiting, and how we, increase and continue to raise that bar of talent at a particular company. And I'm having a ton of fun doing it here at GitHub.
Awesome. So yeah, you're recruiting across the spectrum here, which is awesome. The VP role specifically, I'm curious about, because it seems to me that in a lot of cases, even companies with pretty robust built-out talent teams will enlist the help of like an executive search firm. So how have you gone about sourcing for and finding some of these high-level people?
Yeah, I mean, I can't say we're too different in that respect. I know when I started here, we did engage a lot of different firms, a lot of agencies, and worked with different partners too from an investing perspective to help us kind of build out those talent pools. I think we're just at a healthier spot now where we know what it means to be a leader at GitHub, and we know what we're looking for in leadership at GitHub. And naturally, I think part of it also comes from us being competitive as sourcers and recruiters. Like, agency fees are expensive, right? So when it allows for it, and when we know far enough in advance that we're going to have an opportunity open up, we'd rather open it up in-house. Because I think the most important thing is, at the end of the day, like, nobody knows the culture as well as someone who's internal.
Exactly,
right?
Yeah.
And having that middleman, it's kind of like a game of telephone. And I think we found that out the hard way. I think most companies do. But when someone else is reaching out to people on behalf of your company and they're not following up in a timely manner, or they don't know how to answer the questions, right? Sometimes things get made up in that process. And by the time the candidate gets to you as the company, they're like, oh, I heard it's this role with this title on this team. And you're like, I don't even know where you got that from. Like, we don't have any of those benefits. The team is this, like, team is half the size you thought it was, right? Like, where did you get this information? But again, someone else is selling on your behalf, this third party. And so naturally, just like a game of telephone, the story gets changed and manipulated all the way up the ladder, right? So we prefer to approach all of our searches in-house. We really don't use agencies that heavily anymore. There's maybe, a few here and there that we need for particular like global situations because we do hire all over the world.
Right.
Like Japan is particularly really difficult for us, right? So we do engage individuals here and there, but for the most part, we do try to keep all of our sourcing and recruiting in-house.
Gotcha. So especially with the VP level, that's going to be a much longer recruiting process than normal. And also a lot of the selling that traditionally might fall on the recruiter is going to fall on C-levels to kind of share their vision for the company and the extent of the VP role. So I'm curious how you see your role differently, or if you see it differently on the VP hires as opposed to other individual contributor hires, and if so, like what that role is.
Again, I think a lot of this is company specific, right? Like GitHub's really flat, and we've always been fairly flat. And it's just recent that we've started really building out a more robust management structure. So having individuals that aren't just ICs, and looking at people managers and directors and senior directors and all the way up into, VP, SVP and above. I think the role has remained fairly consistent. And a lot of my job is to do that initial reach out, sell the idea of the role, get them engaged, get them interested. But I do chat with every single candidate on the phone before I present them over to the hiring manager. And even in these situations, that really hasn't changed. I think like maybe the things that I focus more on become less around, oh, there's a ping pong table, right? Or we've got free gummy bears. You really have to know what you're selling and know your audience. And I think at that level, you have to kind of shift the story to say, this is the impact you're making, right? Like this is the team that you'll be owning. Quite candidly, this is where the team is at. Sometimes that's a good story. Sometimes that's a bad story. But I think the important part is it's always an honest story, or should always be the honest story, because you're asking someone to leave their job. But then also focusing on the things that look important to them on their profile, right? Remote work, is that something you're interested in? Really great benefits, parental leave. Think of the areas of the company that are more progressive than most areas and other companies, and how you can really kind of utilize those to reach out to that candidate and just pique their interest. And then, of course, I always try to kind of caveat it with, it's a partnership. And so if you're working with those executives, letting them know that and setting those expectations up front. I will do sourcing. I will do the reach out. I anticipate to talk to everyone. But if someone comes to me and says they'd rather just talk with you, and that's going to happen, right? Some people just want to talk to the executive. Are you willing to hop on the phone with them? Like, what would you need from me in order to be willing for that, right? So again, just setting those expectations up front has usually resulted in just really positive relationships. And, to the you made earlier, like, it's a partnership and we're in this together and we both want to make a hire. So typically you see a pretty positive response to that by the executives you work with.
So you mentioned something about being able to front load, or maybe not front load, but at least feature the things that someone finds really important, whether that's benefits, the ability to work from home, etc. Mm-hmm. So I'm curious how you go about identifying that, because it's pretty standard to ask someone, what are you looking for in your next role? But I mean, there's a good answer to that, right? Which is like, oh, I want to be part of a team and I want to have, I want to be challenged and blah, blah, blah. So I guess how do you sort of take that next step to find out what is it that truly makes someone tick? Like, what do they really, like, on a personal level value, so that you can make sure to feature that, or on the converse, tell them, look, we don't have the ability to work from home 3 days a week. This might not be a good fit for you.
Yeah, absolutely. I think going back to the R word that I said I was going to drop a few times on here, research, right? And I think that's where those other social media profiles really come in handy. It's like, don't just stop with, oh, I saw their profile on LinkedIn. They look good. I'm going to reach out. Do the extra work. Go to their LinkedIn profile. Do they have a blog? A lot of times engineering candidates in particular, but also marketing, product teams, they'll have blogs that they've created themselves where they post the pictures of things they're excited about, their hobbies, right? Some of the additional work that they're doing, the volunteer organizations that they're part of, things that aren't always listed up front on their LinkedIn profiles. Go look at their Facebooks, right? What do they like? What are they following? What does it seem like they get really genuinely excited about, and build off of that? Like, yes, in some respects, there's a creepy component to it, right? But it's only as creepy as you make it. So if you do find something like their blog or a personal website saying like, hey, I read some of your blog posts and I see that you get really excited about cats. Like you mentioned that you own 5 cats. I personally own 2 dogs myself. So I know we already might have some issues with one another, but our mascot's a cat and I'd love to send you some cat swag, right?
Right.
So not even approaching it as like, oh, you're so impressive for this role. Here's the job description. But now I'm already building this rapport. Like I read about you. I took the time out of my day. I see the things you're excited about. Well, guess what? We have a cat Slack channel here. Like you'd love being part of it. You should totally chat with someone on the team. Here's such and such. They've got 8 cats. They live in the same area as you, right? Be creative with these things. Like do the extra work because it's going to pay off in the long run. The likelihood of someone responding to that message versus just one of your generic general messages you get is so much higher, right? And track those things. Like if you continue to do really creative messages and you're actually getting a lower response, then okay, maybe it's not for you. Maybe we are being slightly creepy. We need to figure that out. Have someone else read it first. But just make sure you're measuring these things. But at the end of the day, like there are so many other platforms that people are part of that help you get to know that person better. You kind of have to think of it as like online dating, right? Like if someone swipes on you and you're a connection or a match, forgive me, I don't use Tinder, so I don't know if it's like right or left or up or down. But one of those directions around, you usually end up doing some recon, right? And we don't always get the chance to like text back and forth with our candidates and get to know about them. Like, do you like dogs? How many kids do you want? Like, obviously there's things we can and can't ask inappropriate questions. But with that being said, like we usually do look up people on Facebook, on LinkedIn. Like we want to know more about them before we go meet them. We should be doing the same kind of work before we go talk to someone on the phone about potentially doing something that would change their whole life, taking
Absolutely.
a new job, joining a new company.
Yeah. I love that in your example, every person had more and more animals as you went along.
I really like animals.
By the time you get to the hiring manager, it's
I love dogs.
Oh, I have 19 cats. You'll totally fit in here.
I just have cats. That's all I do. No, I have a ton of dogs. I will say we have a dog Slack channel. We have the cat Slack channel. Like we are big animal lovers here at GitHub. And I think part of it also stems from the fact that my dad still thinks that I work for like some kind of cat company. Like he's not really sure. He thinks that I foster them or maybe like take care of them or that we foster cats because he just sees all of the clothing I wear with cat logos everywhere.
Right.
And he's not tech savvy. So he's like, yeah, Tessa, she works with the cats. So everyone back in Idaho knows. Like Tessa's the cat girl.
She recruits cats.
Yes, I do something with cats. So something very important with cats. So sorry, it might come up a few more times.
No, I love it. Awesome. So hopefully there's going to be plenty of cat examples on your webinar, which is coming up the 16th. And there is a link to sign up for it in the episode description. Otherwise, it's on the Entella website. It's easy to find, or hit me up directly and I can send it out to you. All of you out there in podcast land who desperately want to hear more from Tessa, there's a ton more she has to cover, technical stuff that we didn't want to steal the spotlight of here in the podcast. But Tessa, this has been awesome. I've loved chatting with you. I could keep going for a while, but let's halt it at optimal podcast length here. But yeah, this has been amazing. Thank you so much for calling in. The webinar is going to be awesome. Can't wait for that. And I don't know what else to say. You're the best.
Thanks, Rob. I'm excited to chat with everyone at the webinar. All right.
Once again, that was Tessa Wilder over at GitHub. Thank you so much for tuning in. I hope you tune into the webinar as well. That just about does it for us here at Entella and hiring on all cylinders. Once more, I've been Rob Stevens, and you've been amazing, wonderful, talented, darling recruiters. Have a spectacular week, and happy hunting.